Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea's producer prices rose in August to an all-time high, and they've been rising for 10 months in a row. Some of it is temporary, but overall, experts say prices won't be coming down for a while. Global oil prices are at their highest in 2 months, almost at their peak since the start of the pandemic. Inventories in the U.S. are at their lowest in years, partly because of recent hurricanes hitting production. And South Korea reports its highest yet number of coronavirus cases, more than 2,400, and that could rise as people get tested now that the Chuseok holiday is over. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea's producer prices rose to a record high in August, and it was the 10th monthly increase in a row. The producer price index was mainly driven higher by agricultural and industrial products. Some of that, experts say, was seasonal or temporary, but prices overall are not expected to come down for a while. Yo-jong has more.
South Korea's producer prices, a key barometer of future consumer inflation, reached an all-time high in August. They rose for the 10th month in a row, which is the second longest period that the prices have risen since records began in 1965. The Bank of Korea said on Friday that its producer price index stood at 110.72, up 0.4% on month. It was also up 7.3% on year, the biggest increase in a decade.
The higher producer prices were mainly led by agricultural products due to the unusually hot summer and frequent rainfall. They were also driven by higher household demand for livestock products, including beef and pork.
The prices of agricultural products increased by 2.1%. The price of spinach skyrocketed by around 86%, and the price of cabbage soared by roughly 47%. Livestock product prices also rose by 1%, with beef increasing by around 5% and pork by roughly 3%. The central bank also attributed the rise to the higher prices of industrial goods, which edged up by 0.4%. That was led by greater demand for chemical and metal products, although some products saw prices fall due to lower global oil prices. Service prices also edged up by 0.3%, mainly due to restaurants and accommodation as they hit their peak summer season. Prices of vacation resorts jumped by around 23% and hotels increased by 5%. Also, prices of domestic air services rose by 13%, with international flights rising by around 2.4%. One expert says producer prices are likely to remain high in the near future.
Producers price index, I think, will be very, very variable, but it will still be high because the production is being affected by the coronavirus. There is a production bottleneck because a lot of intermediate parts and raw materials are not getting to the factories on time, not only because of problems in production, but also problems in transportation, both in Korea and internationally because of the coronavirus.
He added that consumer prices are also expected to be high in the coming months. 엄지영, Arirang News.
And supply issues are forecast to push oil prices even higher this winter. Right now, they're at the highest point since July, which was the peak since the start of the pandemic. Demand for fuel is recovering, but U.S. inventories are drawing down because of the aftermath of 2 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. U.S. crude stocks last week fell to their lowest since October 2018. This afternoon, Brent crude was at about $76.5 US. Goldman Sachs is forecasting that to rise to $80 this winter, and according to Bloomberg, Goldman sees $90 as possible if this winter is colder than usual. West Texas Intermediate is at about $73.30. Some analysts are forecasting the price of memory chips, which make up about a fifth of South Korea's exports, to fall sharply in the fourth quarter. The Taiwanese market research firm TrendForce projects the price of DRAM chips in the final 3 months of this year to drop by up to 8% from this quarter. It cited declining demand for consumer electronics such as smartphones and TVs, due in part to excess inventory. The price of NAND flash chips is also expected to go down by as much as 0.5%. For the first half of this year, South Korea has reported an all-time high trade surplus in intellectual property. Preliminary data from the Bank of Korea on Friday show that the trade balance in IP came to $850 million, the most on a semi-annual basis since 2010, when the figure was first compiled. The BOK attributed the rise to exports of art and culture, like the K-pop group BTS and the movie Space Sweepers. IP exports were up more than 40% in the first half of this year compared to the same period last year, mainly on music and video content. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thank you for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start with Wall Street, coming off the Fed's latest meeting and with the ongoing situation in China, of course, with the real estate conglomerate Evergrande. Stocks closing much higher on Thursday and almost getting back to where we were earlier this month. Jerome Powell saying an announcement on tapering could come soon, and it seems maybe the market's okay with the idea. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it's sharply risen for the second consecutive session on Thursday. Dow was up about 500 points, and S&P 500 was rising by about 1.2%, and NASDAQ added another 1%. Clearly, investors were concerned about the Evergrande debt crisis at the beginning of this week, but it seems that people are thinking that it can be contained. But in the afternoon today, we saw quite a bit of volatility regarding the Evergrande debt crisis. They're saying that the Evergrande did not pay the interest payment that was due. Anyway, volatility continued to remain quite strong. But as far as the U.S. market is concerned, they were taking this news wasn't really impacted at the time. So market continued to go up higher with the news coming from the FOMC statements that yes, tapering might be coming in as end of November or at the end of this year, but there's a slowdown in a sense that the inflation pressure or the labor market might not be as strong to result into the rate hike that Fed might not be doing it anytime soon. So when we look at these initial claims for the joblessness, we saw that second week of rising trend, and also the service PMI number came out, and it slowed down in the September. So clearly, it is indicating that the pressure on the inflation side might be subdued, and then if the economic growth rate is slowing down, there might not be a need for rate hike. Tapering might happen, but maybe in a slow pace than most people are expecting at this point in time. All in all, we did see most of the sectors showing quite strong rise, including the IT sectors and even energy sector with the oil prices rising. All in all, U.S. market was quite strong. But as far as the Asian markets today, it seems that market's been quite volatile despite the U.S. market being very strong.
Well, now an issue you mentioned just now in China, Evergrande, and it was supposed to make a bond coupon payment yesterday of around $83 million. As of a little while ago, still no word whether that happened or not. Perhaps you could update us, but some uncertainty here in the Korean market today, and some of that at least because of the rise in the coronavirus cases. So tell us about the domestic market.
Right. If you look at the Korean market, it started as quite strong, but ever since towards the end of the morning session, it did go down to negative territories, and it ended at slight negative territories for Kospi, and pretty much fairly flat. And Kosdaq was also fairly flat, slightly up but very flat. It's the retail investors and the foreign investors were net buyers, but the institutional investors were net sellers. The main reason for that is because clearly there's a possibility that the Evergrande Group did not pay the coupon payment, and that resulted into, if you look at the Chinese market, it did go from the plus to negative territories towards the end of the session, but not to the significant amount. All in all, I guess people are still continue to be concerned about the liquidity issues for the Evergrande Group, and I guess I think this is quite politically driven in a sense. We think that the government might be the one who will be taking over the operation probably and maybe changing the management in the future with the current liquidity issues. I don't think that this is going to be a contingent problem that it might spread to the possibility of the Chinese market doing a recessionary picture, but I don't think that will happen anytime soon. Chinese government has ample liquidity and ample support and proper reserve to support the current property market. And if you look at the property prices-wise, it didn't go down. It's still going uptrend. It's about YOY 4% growth rate. So therefore, I think this is a short-term liquidity issue, a political issue that is resulting into the Evergrande, and that is affecting the Asian market of afternoon today. I guess in a longer-term basis, we need to watch out how this plays out. Nevertheless, we think that the Chinese currencies, renminbis, are fairly stable. Interest rates are very stable, and people are expecting the government will be stepping in to resolve these issues before the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in the early next year. All in all, we think that this is a short-term volatility issue rather than a long-term issue, and the default issue is not going to be long-lasting. A lot of people are saying that this may be a similar type of what we saw in 2007 of Lehman cases. I don't think that's the case. We think that this will be contained quite reasonably well, and therefore next week we expect the markets to recover from the quite volatility that we saw this week.
Well, staying here in Korea for a minute, the remarkable movements in the market we've seen in the pandemic have drawn in a lot of investors who are taking on as much debt as they can to buy stocks. Similar story in real estate, even crypto. In the Korean media, we hear these phrases about young people leveraging even their souls. What do you make of the risks out there, whatever they may be, from Evergrande to tapering, and how the added risk of debt figures into that?
Right. A lot of people are talking about the issue about the debt. There's always an issue about the debt with a low interest rate environment. But I think that what's important is what is the percentage of the debt versus the GDP number. If you look at the global GDP growth rate, with this kind of huge boosting measures that we saw, obviously that resulted into huge amount of debt increases for the government and most of the overall global debt. But at the same time, with this kind of boosting measures, that resulted into quite strong base case of the GDP growth rate. And therefore, if you look at the previous quarters of the global debt as percentage of GDP, global GDP, it sharply fell. If you look at the total global debt, reached about $300 trillion, but percentage-wise, the previous quarter was as 362%, which was the record high number. Now has fallen after 1 quarter later, even though the debt size increased, it fell down to 353%. We saw this kind of trend right after the Second World War, when we saw inflation kicking in and GDP growth rate rising, and debt size not rising as fast as these GDP growth rate, and therefore we did see global economy recovering in a sense that the percentage of debt falling quite sharply. We think that that can be happening again. A lot of people are concerned about this issue about this debt size. We should not be just looking at the absolute debt size, but what is that as a relative terms of the GDP. We think that when the asset value goes up, resulting into the lower leverage ratios. We think that that should be taken as a positive news, and it's not going to be impacting global financial market as most people are concerned about. If the tapering comes through, this is a picture where the abnormality becoming a normal stage. I think that what we really should be worried about is when interest rate hike happens from the various central banks. And we don't think that that will be happening anytime soon with this kind of debt size. We need to boost the asset prices resulting into a lower leverage ratios. So in order to do that, we need to keep the interest rate low, and that's happening globally. And therefore, we think that the asset price rising trend should continue in the future.
We might end the conversation on that somewhat reassuring note, Mr. Yu, then. So we'll have to leave it there for today. And thank you, as always, for coming on and sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
You too. South Korea reported its highest number of new coronavirus cases since the start of the pandemic on Friday. The figure is expected to keep rising in the coming days as more people get tested after the holiday that ended this week when tens of millions of people traveled. Social distancing measures were temporarily eased during Chuseok for gatherings, but now they'll get a little stricter. Choi Min-jung has the latest.
South Korea reported its highest daily coronavirus tally on Friday with 2,434 confirmed cases. The spike comes after millions traveled around the nation during the 5-day Chuseok holiday. The majority of the cases were reported in the capital region, with the daily figure exceeding 1,700 in the area for the very first time.
The numbers are increasing with more people getting tested in the capital area after Chuseok. The figure is expected to rise further tomorrow, as well as next week.
Authorities are also warning of another potential surge in regions outside the capital area, similar to what happened after the summer vacation period. Given the post-Chuseok surge, some medical experts say the daily tally could even hit the 3,000 mark. Now that the holidays are over, people must follow the stricter social distancing measures that were in place before Chuseok. Starting Friday, for areas under social distancing level 4, up to a maximum of 6 people can gather. But 2 people must be fully vaccinated when gathering before 6 p.m., while at least 4 people must be fully inoculated when meeting after 6 p.m. People are classed as fully vaccinated 2 weeks after receiving their final vaccine dose. Elsewhere, under social distancing level 3, up to 8 people can gather regardless of the time if 4 people have completed vaccinations. Also starting Friday, those fully vaccinated who come into close contact with a COVID-19 patient will be exempt from a 2-week quarantine, but they still have to take 2 PCR tests, one right after the contact and another in 6 to 7 days. This rule will apply even if the original patient is infected with a variant of the virus. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
In the United States, the death toll from COVID-19 has now surpassed that of the Spanish flu a century ago. Experts are on the lookout for potentially even more contagious variants like the Mu variant, which appeared recently. Kim Hyun-sung reports.
The Spanish flu ravaged the world more than a century ago and made its mark as one of the world's deadliest pandemics by causing an estimated 50 million deaths worldwide. From 1918 to 1919, 675,000 people died in the U.S. And as of this week, COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. has surpassed that figure, with more than 680,000 deaths.
The fact that COVID-19 deaths have surpassed the Spanish flu death toll in the U.S. in the 21st century, when medical systems, vaccines, and hygiene are much more advanced than 100 years ago, should tell how threatening this pandemic is.
The world's COVID-19 death toll is still some way behind that of the Spanish flu. But to judge the danger of the disease by the sheer number of deaths would be an unfair comparison. Rather, we'd have to look at the mortality rates, one expert says.
The Spanish flu had an estimated mortality rate of 2.5%. The world's mortality rate for COVID-19 is around 2%. So just looking at the fatality rates, COVID-19 and the Spanish flu bear a lot of similarities.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization late last month listed another variant of interest, the Mu variant.
The Mu variant is found in around 40 countries, but there's no evidence yet of whether it trumps the Delta variant in transmissibility.
A recent report by WHO shows that the variant makes up only 0.1% of COVID-19 cases worldwide, but has grown to almost 40% of Colombia's cases. Scientists say the Mu carries a spike gene mutation similar to Beta, a strain that has shown some ability to evade vaccines, so they're still weighing up how concerned they should be of the new strain. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
The North Korean leader's sister, Kim Yo-jong, has called South Korean President Moon Jae-in's recent offer to declare an official end to the Korean War an interesting and good idea, but only under certain conditions, which would include an end to what the North sees as a hostile U.S. policy towards it. Kim Dami reports.
The North Korean leader's sister Kim Yo-jong said Friday that the North is open to constructive discussions to improve inter-Korean relations if the South drops what she called its hostile attitude toward the regime. In a statement released by the North state media, Kim called South Korean President Moon Jae-in's recent proposal for an end-of-war declaration a, quote, interesting and good idea.
The North has lowered the threshold for talks, but is still keeping the one condition, an end to hostile policies against the regime.
Kim also said it's a double standard to condemn what she called the North's self-defensive moves while rationalizing those of others, an apparent criticism of Seoul's joint military drills with Washington and the South's recent test firing of an SLBM. Kim's relatively toned-down statement came just hours after the North's Vice Foreign Minister Lee Tae-sung called the proposal of an end-of-war declaration premature. Observers say Pyongyang is making sure to use Seoul's proposal as a way to get what it wants.
The North is urging the South to take concrete steps and not just talk. It's also an indirect message telling Seoul to convince Washington to create the right conditions for talks.
President Moon proposed at the UN General Assembly earlier this week that the two Koreas, the US and possibly China, declare an end to the war that technically is still going on following the Armistice Agreement in 1953. While carefully analyzing Kim's latest remarks, Seoul's Unification Ministry reiterated its long-held stance that the government will continue its efforts to restore inter-Korean ties. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
The top diplomats of South Korea and Japan held talks in New York City on the sidelines of the UN, but that meeting only reaffirmed their countries' differences on a number of historical and trade-related issues. However, there was one matter they could agree on: North Korea. Yoon Jung-min reports.
Meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, the foreign ministers of South Korea and Japan discussed on Thursday a range of conflicting issues, but could not narrow their differences. During the 15-minute talk, South Korean Foreign Minister Jong explained the government's stance on Korean victims of wartime forced labor and sex slavery and called for Tokyo to lift its trade restrictions on Seoul as early as possible. Jong urged his Japanese counterpart to find a solution together and continue diplomatic talks. Japan's Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi reiterated the Japanese government's earlier stance on those thorny issues. Japan has been insisting that the compensation issue of those victims was completely resolved following the Seoul-Tokyo bilateral treaty in 1965. Reportedly, there also have been talks about Japan's plan to dump radioactive wastewater from Fukushima into the ocean, as well as territorial issues surrounding South Korea's easternmost island of Dokdo. Their talks came ahead of a leadership change in Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. The party will elect a successor to outgoing Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, who has been hawkish on issues involving South Korea. Experts say it's unlikely, though, that bilateral ties will improve even after a new leader is appointed.
Each candidate running for the LDP leadership has a bit of a different view on South Korea. But basically, they all have a quite hardline stance regarding the forced labor and comfort women issues. So such stance is not likely to dramatically change.
Despite those conflicting issues, the diplomats agreed to work together along with the U.S. on issues related to North Korea and regional peace. Also discussed were reviving people-to-people exchanges between the two countries once the COVID-19 situation improves. Yoon Arirang News.
The UN says the pandemic has made North Korea's food shortages worse, and it needs outside assistance. And a report from UNICEF says nearly 1 in 5 young North Korean children are malnourished. Peunji has this report.
The United Nations has designated North Korea as one of the 44 countries in need of external assistance for food. In its latest quarterly crop prospects and food situation report on Thursday local time, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization said a large portion of the North population is suffering from low levels of food consumption and very poor dietary diversity. It added that the economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the population's vulnerability to food insecurity. But it expected the main harvest of the year to reach households by October or November, leading to short-term improvements. Earlier in May, the organization had forecast that North Korea would face a food shortage of around 860,000 tons this year. UNICEF also says nearly 1 in 5 children in North Korea are suffering from malnutrition. Data from its 2021 Child Nutrition Report, released earlier this week, shows that 18% of the country's children under the age of 5 are suffering from malnutrition. This is lower than in 2012 when it recorded 26%, but it's still a very high number compared to other countries. The figures for South Korea and the US were 2% and 3% respectively. At the UN Food System Summit on Wednesday, the U.S. said it is looking for ways to ensure that the basic needs of people in Pyongyang are met. Citing an unnamed government official, VOA News reported that this is something U.S. President Biden is very concerned about. Peunji, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.